Well, it's fresh from the last 2 days. So this is emergency preparedness or some type of preparedness discussion usually. And any of those that I have a part in our ward, I say, don't be afraid, be prepared. And that's really the answer, isn't it? So the topic this evening is one that a lot of people seem to be afraid of, but it's good to be prepared. So this is a statement that we're mostly familiar with in one form or another, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not here to talk about taxes. So who am I? I'm Robin Christofferson. What you may not know about me is I'm a funeral director, and I've been doing that. I've been in the funeral industry for probably over 40 years, 45 years maybe, but 33 years full-time. I worked for a long time in Long Beach at a family-owned mortuary there. In fact, it was owned by our state president in town. And then when my wife and I moved to Murrieta 15 or so years ago, 16 years ago, I went to work here locally for Miller Jones.
Who was that in Long Beach? Sponberg?
Sponberg.
Sponberg, okay.
Yeah.
Grew up there.
Were you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Long Beach 8th Ward,
Oh, yeah, okay.
3rd Ward,
Yeah.
17th Ward.
Peggy and Richard Hart used to be
Yeah,
over there.
yeah, their kids are my good friends.
Okay, I did a lot of scouting things with Peggy when she was
Okay.
state primary president. So anyway, that's who I am. So give me a quick overview of who you are. I bet if I ask you, have you been to a funeral? Probably everybody will raise their hand. None of this group, okay. How many of you have actually gone to the mortuary and planned a funeral for somebody? Not too many. How many have planned your own funeral arrangements?
They're in the
Okay,
works.
couple, huh?
They're in the works.
They're in the works, okay, good. All right, well, then that's usually the way it is. Mine are in the works.
Yeah.
Okay? All right, so here we're talking about funeral planning, you got that. You know, we plan for everything under the sun, don't we? We plan for getting married and our families and going to school and our careers and buying houses, and don't push the buttons too soon. But the thing we don't usually like to talk about is the fact that one day we'll need some type of funeral arrangements for ourselves, okay? So, funeral requires planning too, just like everything else in life. Pre-arranging funeral arrangements and prepaying for them is not uncommon. Probably of the families we serve, about 35% are already pre-arranged. There are some advantages to doing that, and we'll talk about that. So if you are on the fence or thinking about it, you'll have an idea why. But about 34-35% have planned either for themselves, or they've helped maybe a parent or aunt and uncle or somebody else make their arrangements. As I say, about 70% don't seem to be prearranged. So if you haven't done anything, you're not by yourself. Sure.
On that percentage, I mean, most times you don't have prepared for kids or accidents. You always think of a funeral as older age and passing. So, you know, I don't know many kids are in their 20s and 30s and they're thinking about a funeral.
No, they're not thinking about it. They have higher priorities, don't they?
Yeah.
Like the education and family and those things. I understand that. Yeah, you got a question too?
Is it cheaper if you pre-plan it
I'll tell you.
or down to the last?
It is in the sense that the advantages of pre-planning and prepaying is you lock in the price, you have a peace of mind knowing that you've got things in place. Big advantage for most people is that you can make payments. And so that's usually helpful. Whereas if you wait until you've passed away or somebody needs those arrangements, well then, whatever it costs, it's gonna be due and payable then, okay? When you make our kind of guiding principles. We sit down with the family and we want a couple of things to come out of that arrangement. We want it to be choices that are meaningful to the family. We're not there to sell anything in particular. We want it to be affordable. Means we're not trying to take advantage of you, sell you a Cadillac if you're a go-kart family. And it needs to be something that's appropriate, it's the right thing for you and your circumstances and for your family. Okay, so, and I think most of the funeral service folks I've worked with through the years, that is true. Nobody's there to try to take advantage of anybody. So how do you begin? What kind of arrangements are you thinking about? Well, religion colors that. The darker one,
Yeah.
maybe easier. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, I like that.
Perfect.
So your religion, culture, could be tradition within your family or your community. For a lot of people, cost becomes a guiding factor. And just the circumstances. Sometimes if you're on vacation in China, when your day comes and you're trying to get back home, you may make some different choices than you would if you were home, okay? Any questions about anything there, or experiences you want to share about any of that? Yeah.
I'd just like to say that my mom had prepaid for everything, so when she passed, it was
Made it so much
very
easier.
simple.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Now, will there be no cost if you're prepaid for everything? Does that mean there won't be any cost at the time? Well, there could be. Some of the things on your plan are not really under the control of the mortuary, like the cost of death certificates, cemetery costs, and those things. So you might have some out-of-pocket money still, but you'll be way ahead. Yeah.
Rob, when you mentioned circumstances and you said you may be in China, does that mean you have a plan B in place? Like, or
Well,
we go more into that?
I'm just saying, well, actually, if you plan in advance, they do have like a rider, a special travel insurance policy that
Okay,
is
you're going
available
back.
if you want it, that would pay to bring you home.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you do that, but do you do that through travel insurance or through a plan like this?
Well, you can do it with your funeral planning,
Okay.
yeah. If you travel and you take out travel insurance, maybe that covers that sort of thing as well.
So if you die, does, you always have to go through a funeral home?
Craig wants to dig down the desert and dig a hole.
Good idea.
He's thinking that will be much cheaper.
Or they'd be violating your laws.
Yeah, that's the problem with
Build a
that.
funeral pyre.
In California, I'll say,
Well, the reason I ask that, cause I'm qualified for the VA up in Riverside.
uh-huh.
Do they handle all that, or does it always go through a mortuary and then?
Yeah, see, the National Cemetery is a cemetery. And your
You still have
benefit,
to have
your
a funeral.
benefit is free grave for you and your spouse there and
Right.
grave marker and things. But any mortuary or funeral kind of arrangements you have are the family's responsibility.
Family to get up, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, of course, when death occurs, you're not in a happy state of mind, are you? So emotions run high. One of the first concerns, of course, is, how do I say this? My wife's in the easy chair. What do I do now? How do you feel about that, Donna? No, you're not too happy about that? You know, that's a concern, okay? You then, within a day or two, you're gonna be thinking about what kind of service am I gonna have? Be meeting with the funeral home to do whatever it is you're gonna do. And then afterwards, there's people that need to be notified, pension plans, property that's affected, bank accounts, all those sorts of legal and business things to take care of. So there's a lot of things that kind of come along when this happens. Yeah.
So what do you do when somebody dies? Say if you're at home and they die, who do you call? What do you do?
Okay. Well, let's see, if it is, if it's out of the blue, you know? you're
Like a
not-
heart attack or
Yeah, you're not expecting it, well, I would call 911
Okay.
and tell them, my friend has died here at home, and so they will probably send a sheriff police car to your house maybe the paramedics will come to verify their actual passing. They'll get some information from you, you know, is this person under a doctor's care? What kind of history, medical history do they have? Here in Riverside County, they'll contact the county coroner's office and pass all that information along. And if you're 26, the coroner is gonna come and receive you and take you to their office and determine the cause of death. If you're 96, they're probably gonna assume that it was your time. And unless there's evidence of a crime, or, I mean, if your death is caused by an accident or something of that kind, then they investigate to establish the facts. Yes.
So, and you're probably gonna get to this, but for my mom, wanted to be cremated.
Mhm.
So we didn't have to do really anything except they came, took the body, and we didn't have to.
She had prearrangements already? Well, and of course, the advantage of that is they already had on file all the information that was needed to fill in the death certificate. They may have already had her authorization to perform the cremation. So if you planned in advance, when you meet with a funeral home or something, and you can even do it over the phone and by email, it's a matter of reviewing those things and signing whatever needs to be signed at the time and going forward. So it does make it a much simpler process. Although I'm not really here to sell pre-planning, but it's a good idea. Some of the decisions you have to make, of course, is, are we gonna have a traditional kind of funeral with casket burial afterwards? Or are we going to choose cremation? If you choose burial or cremation for that matter, you might have to make decisions about cemetery. You mentioned the National Cemetery. A lot of our veterans here in this area, of course, go there. It's so close. It's a great benefit open to them. Probably the value of that is $6,000 or more to have cemetery taken care of like that.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Does the church have a policy on cremation?
what the church says about cremation is, while they generally favor burial, it's up to the family. If you think about it, we're a worldwide church,
Just gonna say.
and there are nations and cultures and ethnicities all throughout the world where cremation is their choice, the option that they have. Actually, the only sentence or two that's in any of the handbooks related to it is that while the church doesn't encourage, this is almost exact quote, while the church doesn't encourage cremation, if a person is going to be cremated and they are endowed, then they should still be dressed in the temple clothing. Period. That's about what it says.
And I was gonna mention, make sure that you have, you know, that kind of figured out beforehand too, who's gonna put you into that temple clothes, cause I had to do that with my father-in-law, and, he was a big man, and it took, a couple of us, everything we had to be able to dress him.
Yeah.
So you gotta kinda have that pre-thought out as to who's gonna do that.
Yeah, well, of course, generally speaking, if you let them, the mortuary staff would help with that too, but. And then, the last thing on the screen there, you're going to have some kind of a ceremony at church, or something a little simpler at the cemetery, or just have everybody over to the house for, cookies and punch. Whatever's good for you. But why should you include a service? Well, it allows family and friends to come together. I think the talks and the music and things are beautiful, but the most valuable part of a service is the visiting that goes on around it. The person that you didn't even know your father-in-law was acquainted with comes and tells you how his influence affected their life. And those things all just confirm what we've, already from our own personal experience. Sometimes the families hear stories that they didn't even know their family member had been involved in. And should you have a viewing? That's a personal choice. I have a lot of families that say, no, I don't want to do that, and that's all right. But that is a helpful thing for a lot of people to kind of face the reality. Yeah.
What about embalming versus not embalming? I guess you have to be embalmed in order to have a viewing.
Yeah, if you're going to have an open casket and have a viewing, then embalming is a practical necessity.
Right.
It's both for sanitation and
Yeah.
temporary preservation, so that's a better experience.
Right.
Sometimes the families who tell me, no, they're having a casket and a service, but they want the casket closed, don't want any viewing. And I tell them, all right, well, certainly that's your choice, but I'd recommend that perhaps someone in the family come and see them once they're dressed and things are ready, and then you can make that decision. Because they're thinking about them when they were at the hospital or in the bed in the other room there at the house while they were sick and not well, and not how they are going to be presented there at the mortuary.
I'll tell you, the last funeral I went to a couple months ago for a friend of mine who is he's 50-something. He looked just as he did when he was living. They did such a good job.
That's good. I know
It's
we
amazing.
always do our very best. Sometimes circumstances
Right.
don't allow the result to be what we would hope for, but
Mhm.
we know it's an important thing for many, many people. So what are some of the different kinds of services you might have? Let me ask you, we're all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here, are we? Okay, so we pretty well know what, that's got a loose button on that. We pretty well know what our service is gonna be like. Generally, you have a viewing in the Relief Society room for an hour or so, family and some of the friends gather there, you have a family prayer, go to the chapel, have a service not unlike a sacrament meeting with music and a couple of speakers, right?
Yeah.
And then you all traipse off to the cemetery to dedicate the grave. Well, not everybody in our community does it that same way. And I think that's probably tradition is the only reason we always do it that way. I don't think necessarily it has to be that way, but, so, some families will have a service in the chapel at the mortuary, and that isn't uncommon outside of the church, because many people don't have a church connection. Or their church is in a storefront or somewhere, and it's not really conducive to doing it. You can have a visitation the night before the funeral, or have a private time the day before the funeral for the family, and then still, in our case, have a more public time at the church. A memorial service is generally the type of service you have when cremation's been chosen and you're not going to have a casket present there. That could be at the mortuary, it could be at church, of course. And a graveside service is still a funeral service, but in our instance, if one of us were going to have a graveside service, it would be much simpler type of service than you'd have at church. People would gather at the cemetery, you might have a speaker and maybe play some music or someone sing, and have a dedication of the grave, so it's more abbreviated. Where our services in the church run about an hour, and that's new. We used to call them long darn services. Where they'd run an hour and a half, or the son would get up to give the eulogy and speak for an hour and a half himself. Now generally, most bishops keep things to about an hour, and that's a good thing probably. Personal touches that you can add, of course, if the person's a veteran like Brother Shelley there, military honors are available, and the mortuary will contact the branch of service and arrange for that, just as they would make the arrangements for the National Cemetery for veteran or veterans dependent. Some families will want to have a dove release at the cemetery maybe, or a butterfly release. We commonly have a meal or a luncheon together after the service, and a lot of people do that as well. We don't do it in our chapels, but I've seen it more and more in the foyer, where a family's made a slideshow and has it playing on a TV, I think actually in our buildings, that's less effective than when it's done at a mortuary or somewhere where there's, as people are gathering, it's playing in the chapel and people are encouraged to participate. Others will make up a photo display or a collection of, I'm working with a family, the lady was a member of the quilting guild in town, and she's got quilts and all sorts of things that she's made. They're going to bring those into the chapel and display those, because that's a part of who she was. Charitable donations, some people don't want a fortune spent on flowers. They suggest their friends remember them by making a donation to some worthy cause, either of the friend's choice or they will recommend it. Anybody had any experience with any of these at service you've been to?
A lot of the services I've been to that are not LDS, it's like a testimony meeting, you know? They just hold the mic and they say, anybody wants to come up to the mic and talk, and
Yeah, there might be some
There's a
music
lot
that
of
the
that.
pastor maybe offers a message, but they will allow a time of sharing. And people can spend a minute or two to tell a story, and hopefully they're good, uplifting stories. Sometimes they're not, so it's good to kind of, if you intend to do that, that's your service, it's good to kind of screen who you want to do. So some of the things, of course, that'll be a factor merchandise-wise that you'll make decisions about. If you've chosen burial, then you'll, of course, need a casket. It's not a legal requirement, but virtually every cemetery in Southern California that I've ever had dealing with requires some type of a container. The jargony name for that is an outer burial container or a burial vault that the casket's placed inside of, so it's not directly in contact with the earth. You're gonna, you could purchase clothing, but most families do that on their own, bring it to the funeral home, or they use clothing that the person has in their own wardrobe. If you've chosen cremation, of course, you don't need a casket, but there is still a container that's used for the cremation itself. So there are several choices for that you'll choose. And then afterwards, an urn or appropriate container for the loved one to be placed in after cremation. With cremation, you can take the urns home and keep them at home with you. Sometimes spouses will do that with the idea that then when they themselves pass, they'll both be placed in a cemetery or do something together at that time. Or of course you can be placed in a cemetery, in a niche, or in a space in the ground. And Brother Shelley, you have both those choices if you were choosing cremation. Actually, Sister Shelley, you have both those choices at the National Cemetery, in the ground or in a niche. Cremated remains can be scattered at sea. You asked about burial on land. I helped a family who had a ranch in Wyoming. They had funeral service here, put the casket in the back of a pickup truck, and drove to Wyoming, and buried it on their land. So,
I have any questions
And
about
that's
that.
legal?
in Wyoming.
So
Not here.
Utah, right?
Yes.
How long ago was that, and did they have to pull a permit?
Well, so when you talk about documentation,
Yeah,
when death occurs, it must be registered with the government.
right.
So a death certificate is filled out, the mortuary fills out about half of the form, the doctor, the medical authority involved fills out all the medical information. It's then registered with the health department, and a permit for disposition of human remains is issued. And that gives authority for cremation to take place, or for the casket to be placed in a cemetery, or for it to go out of state to someplace.
So it does.
So they took a permit with them. In some states, when you got into town, you'd have to exchange that California document for a local document. But I'm thinking in Wyoming and the Wild Frontier, nobody here is from Wyoming. The Wild Frontier, you own a ranch with a family cemetery already on it, you probably are in control.
Just drive there.
Because
My dad was spread over his ranch, it was 180 acres
Yeah,
up in Santa Maria, and
yeah, well, you can, that's the other thing. In California, you can be scattered at sea, you can be scattered over land with permission of the property owner. So you
Giving
can't
permission.
just wander out into the desert legally and do that in a, you know, state park or federal lands or something like that. You'd never be given permission. Yes?
Something, if somebody takes the urn home and that, how would they know whatever you did, except they'd have laws, but, I mean, nobody'd know what you do with those ashes.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are no cremation police that are gonna come around in 5 years and knock on your door and say,
What was
show me
you
that
wrote in
urn.
the wind?
Yeah. No, that's not going to happen. You're absolutely right.
But it sounds like it is possible that you can transport your own loved one out of state
Yes.
to a cemetery.
Sure you can.
Okay, cause my
Sure you
dad just moved my grandfather, who passed away in 2003, and it, out of Rose Hills, and it cost, up to Utah, and it cost about 15 grand to have it done.
Yeah,
And
disinterment at the cemetery and
Yeah.
transportation.
Okay, well, and-
15 years later, maybe a new casket, all
Yes.
sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah, so there's a lot of cost in that, and so we're worried because my in-laws live here in California, but their plots are in Utah,
Yeah,
and, trying to budget for that.
yeah. Well, no, you can certainly do that.
Okay.
There's
I
nothing
like
to
it.
say,
Easier to do.
as long as it's registered. Don't,
I just
don't
seat
cross the
belt him
border
into
without
the-
having, yeah.
Just seat
Or
belt
on
him
the,
into
or on the roof of the
passenger.
car,
Yeah.
like for a family vacation.
Right, like family vacation. I was thinking we could
Okay,
do that.
I think we've covered all of this, all right. So, no, that's good, that's good. So, burial or cremation, you know, one of the decisions on that is, are you going to use a cemetery? Or is it going to keep them at home? I send a lot of urns home with people. And occasionally we get a call from U-Haul Truck Rentals or
No more.
some landlord or somebody say, well, our tenant moved out, or they turned back this truck,
No.
and there's an urn in it. What do we do? And we'll say, well, call the medical examiner, there's nothing I can do for you.
Do they come and get it?
Huh?
Do they s-
No, you probably have to take it to them if they agree to take it. But anyway, these of course are a consideration, whichever kind of arrangement you make. So what are financial arrangements? Well, of course, if you've waited until the time of need, as we've said, understandably, I think payment's gonna be due before the services actually occur. That doesn't mean the day that you walk into the mortuary, you have to write a check or hand over your credit card, but probably in the next week or two before funeral arrangements are.
Is that pretty standard with all mortuary services?
It is. I'll tell you, years ago, when I first started, it was like 30 days, same as cash for everybody, you know. Oh, you have an insurance policy, okay, well, when the insurance company pays the claim, you come back and pay me.
3 years later.
And that was actually pretty okay, but every year, maybe there were 4 or 5% of families that just never quite made it back through the door. And at some point, I think we decided that wasn't really fair to everybody else, because of course their expenses still had to be paid. And so everybody else kind of shared in that, so just ask everybody to pay, and if we make arrangements with you and the total comes to, enough that takes your breath away and you can't see it ever
And then
happening.
you die right there.
Well, we'll, yeah, that's right. We'll suggest ways to help you trim that down, you know? Cause we're not there, as I said before, we want it to be affordable, we want it to be appropriate for you. We're not there trying to take advantage of anybody, so.
So, thinking of it a little expensive, what is the most expensive? Usually I always think of it as casket, when you got them gold laid and all that. Is that the most expensive?
Elements
Process.
of arrangements?
Yeah, as far as, you know, do you buy a $10 casket or a $800 casket?
Well, you can, you certainly can. Probably not $10,
Yeah.
you're living in the past there, but. I'll tell you, a full traditional funeral service like we generally have, our professional services are about $3,500.
Oh, that's
But that includes, you know, transport from where the person died, making all the arrangements with the family and the cemetery and the church, and getting the death certificate with the doctor over the course of several days back and forth, and transportation to the church in our case, you know, and transport to the cemetery. And so there's a lot of time involved for people. Those funeral cars that you see rolling down the highway or out in front of the church cost $70,000-$80,000 or more a piece, so all of it's kind of expensive.
So the advantage of planning ahead is the price won't go up.
That's right.
And you can
That's right.
pay it off.
You can lock it in.
And make payments and
You
not.
can lock it
one
in
lump.
and you can make payments.
What's the cost for a burial plot?
Yeah, that's.
Well, let me finish,
Okay.
this. So professional service, about $3,500. Caskets on our price list range from $840 for one that you wouldn't use unless that was all you could afford, to the very most expensive, that Cadillac solid mahogany polish so you can clean your teeth in the reflection is $10,000,
That's what I want.
$9,999. That's the one you want? All right. On
Golden
average,
lady.
on average, I say most families choose a casket probably in the range, you know, of some sales tax and everything on it, about $2,500. So the math there is easy, it's about $6,000.
So they get you on the sales tax. Gosh, you die, you still gotta pay
Still
tax.
On merchandise, in California, that's the way it is.
How
So
ridiculous.
around $6,000. Can you pay a lot more than that? Sure you can, but you don't have to.
So go to a low tax state.
Cemetery, you asked that question, so let me go back to that. Cemetery, well, as I said, at the National Cemetery, the value of that companion grave, it's so two people can be buried in the same grave, grave liners, headstone, all of that's provided by the government if you're a veteran. Value of that is, in a private cemetery, it'd be $6,000 to $10,000. In a private cemetery, you know, it's like real estate. You want to be buried over in the shade of the trees? It's more expensive than if you're on the sunny hill.
Want the view? Yeah.
But let's think about where we live, okay? Where we are here, virtually every cemetery within an hour's drive is, well, the National Cemetery's up in Riverside. All the rest are district cemeteries, quasi-governmental cemeteries, like the one right here, Laurel Cemetery on Ivy, that are set up for the residents, mostly of the city, but really a geographical area. And they are supported in part by your property taxes. So if you live within their district territory, you know, you pay less than if you live on the other side of the street.
When you say
outside the
territory, is that living within Marietta?
What's that?
Is that living within Marietta?
Yeah, basically, yeah. We live in Marietta, but we're over on that newcomers east side over there by Marietta Hot Springs, you know, kind of where you are.
Right.
It wasn't, when we first moved here 16 years ago, it wasn't part of their district. It may have been annexed and by the city, it might have been part of the city, but at that point, the district didn't coincide. I think they've remedied some of that now. But if you or I were to pass and want to be buried here at Laurel Cemetery, they would ask us for our address, they'd verify that we lived in the district, so, and the only other private cemetery in this area is the one in Sun City, Menifee Valley Cemetery, which is run and operated by Miller Jones Mortuary.
So those are the only two cemeteries in
The
this
only
area?
two, well, no, so there's district cemeteries, there's one in Paris and Wildemar and Murrieta and Temecula. There's one in Lake Elsinore. I said Paris, didn't I?
Yeah.
There's one in San Jacinto for San Jacinto Hemet area. And then when you get up to Riverside, there are a couple of other cemeteries there as well. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I just want to throw out the suggestion to always check Craigslist. I know that sounds shady, but it's always done legitimately. Whoever's selling it and the seller and the buyer meet down at the cemetery.
Arrange a transfer.
Right, in a range of transfer, you get a deed for the property just like you would like a home. But I paid for was it Cresslawn, which is in Norco. When my mom passed away, I paid $2,600 for 2 plots that the cemetery sells for $6,000 each.
Yeah, that's
What are
true.
the circumstances that someone would be, like
Okay,
they decided to get
I'll tell
separated
you,
somewhere else?
we used to live there, we bought them,
Mhm.
and now we live out of
Out of
state
state.
or
Mhm.
somewhere
Yeah.
else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have no use for them, the cemetery won't buy them back, or if the cemetery will buy it back from you, they'll pay you the $600 you paid for them in 1980 or something.
Exactly.
And so that's why.
Interesting.
Now, oftentimes a family doesn't, in that emotional state they're in, they don't feel like they, wanna go through that to try to figure that out, but sure, that's a good tip. Yeah.
Are there certain things that you would look for in choosing a cemetery, or even a cemetery? Let's start there.
Okay. Well, if I was deciding, of course, one of my concerns, am I gonna be living here? And then, when you drive through the gate, what does it look like? When you go in the office and talk to the folks, do you feel happy that you're talking to them? Or do you feel like they don't care, or they're just there to sell you the most expensive plot under the trees, or, you wanna feel comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah. Cemetery property, like everything else, in this, discussion, if you purchase them now, you will have paid less than if you wait 10 years or 20 years until you need them,
Are most of those, if you buy it now and move, can you sell that? Or is it, is that dependent on the mortuary? Are there-
Cemetery property,
Yeah,
well, when you purchase cemetery property, you're actually purchasing the right to be interred
that
there.
land.
Yeah. So, what you can do is, as I've said, the cemetery generally won't buy them back. But you can sell them or transfer your rights to another person. And so there are cemetery brokers who will help facilitate that. You can list it with them. If it's in a popular cemetery, they may buy them from you and sell them themselves. They may take them kind of on a consignment thing and help another family who's trying to find some space near their other, family members who are in the cemetery. But cemetery generally, when you've purchased your space, you've got the space. It can be transferred. When you pre-plan your funeral arrangements, in California here, the money doesn't come, you make payments, but the money doesn't come directly to the mortuary. It's held by a third party. That's your protection, it's really for our mortuary's protection. So, some use a trust account, the money's just held in trust for you. We actually use an insurance product, so it's like a specialized life insurance policy. And so if you arrange your service here, but then you move to Utah, or you moved to Kansas, or moved to any other crazy place you wanted to move, that policy you haven't lost any of the value of that policy. You go into a mortuary there where you're living now and tell them what you've got, and at the very least, you've got the value of what you paid in plus its growth. You don't really have to be sent back here from Kansas just because you have arrangements here with those. So this is the question you've been talking about. How much do funerals cost? The National Funeral Directors Association says on a national average, funerals about probably $7,500 now. Let's go back here. But it includes, that's just the mortuary part of it and the casket. There, as we've said, will be cemetery costs, markers, flowers. If you put an obituary in the newspaper, everybody always seems to be surprised how much that costs. If your obituary in the newspaper was in, say, the Press Enterprise from Riverside, I start with an estimate of about $350 for that, for one day. They charge, of course, based on the length of it, so if you tell all about your elementary school successes, it may be more, but and then if you were to go to San Diego or to the papers over in Orange County or LA County, it's gonna be significantly higher than that. So, pre-arrangements, what are the advantages? I think we probably already talked about this. By planning ahead, you relieve your family of some of the emotional burden of figuring things out. You also have the opportunity to make payments, and you can decide how you'll be remembered. Okay? I can't tell you how many families that I sit down with where, you know, their mom, their grandmother, somebody in advance has already planned things. We're just simply reviewing those arrangements and filling in the details, like what day will the service be, that sort of thing. And when we get down to the end, the family says, oh, this was so much easier than I thought it was gonna be, and I'm so glad that Grandma did this because we didn't have to think about much of it. And of course, it comes at a time when you don't feel like thinking about a whole lot of anything. So advanced planning, there's 3 simple steps of that. You think about what type of arrangements you want, make those selections, you just select whatever merchandise is appropriate for that, and you talk about how you're gonna pre-fund it. Are you gonna make one single payment? Are you gonna make payments over time? I know that I don't do advanced planning, pre-funding kind of thing, because we use a insurance product. Those folks are licensed to sell insurance products, so, but I know that they make payments over 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, some people even say 10 years. So, lots of options. Big question, how will you be remembered? Of course, there are other options too. We've talked about our traditional type of funeral services that we have, and cremation. Well, the very simplest kinds of arrangements, direct burial, you know, no funeral ceremony, no viewing, you don't even need to be embalmed. You just simply, the documentation's all completed, and arrangements made with the cemetery, you're placed in a casket and taken to the cemetery for burial. Or cremation without any kind of ceremonies and things. It just, we make the arrangements, cremation takes place, and your urn is given to the family or taken back to, you know, taken to the cemetery, whatever you've chosen. We've talked about funding, how that's done. You could, you know, some people will say, well, I've got money in the bank, and that's all right. That doesn't guarantee the price, and it also doesn't mean 15 years from now you'll have money in the bank. Especially if you've been in the hospital or you know, convalescent home for a period of time, you can easily go through your finances. It does make it easier for family, blah, blah, blah. You put it on a credit card and hope you never have to pay it. Let's see here. Other folks say, well, I have life insurance, and that's a good thing. Our comment to that usually, well, life insurance is really for the living. You've set aside that fund to help your spouse or to help your children after you've passed and no longer there to provide anything for them, to help them with the medical expenses that they're left with or any of those sorts of things. The other thing about life insurance is generally they won't talk to you about releasing any money until death certificate is in their hands, and that can be a couple of weeks before those are available. And then most processing time is 4 to 6 weeks before they send you a check. So that could be 4 to 6 weeks after you've passed away. And I know you remember, when is the funeral expenses due?
Before they bury you.
Yeah, before the funeral. So that's, you can make assignment if you have life insurance, and you know, it's intended for that. You can, the beneficiary can assign a portion of whatever those proceeds are to the funeral home to pay funeral expenses, but that takes time, and you have to make sure you're working with the right people and all that sort of thing. Any questions or experiences or thoughts about that?
I can throw one more expense on that too.
Yeah.
When my dad passed away, my little sister and I were still in college, out of state, and I had 4 older siblings that were all newish in their careers. The biggest expense my mom had was actually getting everyone in
Oh,
town.
yeah.
The transportation, more so than the funeral expenses. So I think that's something else people should really budget for and plan ahead for.
Well, that's,
Getting people in town.
that's one of those other things. And then they all land at her house and stay for 4 or 5 days, and somebody's feeding them and
Yeah. And the chaos.
everything else that goes with it, yep. Okay, so any closing questions or thoughts that you folks have? We've been asking questions all along, but I'm here to answer questions, if we haven't.
If you're
Yeah.
gonna, give your body away to science, then there's no, they just come get you from wherever you're at, and,
But plan it in advance,
yeah, you gotta plan that in advance.
yeah. You wanna make sure that they want you. And,
Oh, sometimes they don't want you.
well, sometimes.
Don't take it personally.
You might That sounds harsh, doesn't it? There are circumstances where they don't want you, or you're at home on hospice and you intend to donate your body to science, but you die at 2 in the morning. Do they have somebody that is gonna come and receive you at 2 in the morning on the weekend, or your family just ice packs until they come, you know? You know, so that is a good option. Some people do that, but there are some things you wanna know about it and plan in advance.
So you wanna die on Monday through Friday.
Monday through Friday,
Between 9 and 5.
between 9 and 5.
Earlier than 5 p.m.
So what else could you do? Let's see here. What could you do in advance without laying out any money or anything? Well, you could have this conversation with your spouse, with your family. What kind of funeral arrangements do I want? What kind do you think would be right? Talk about those things so it isn't the question I hear all the time, I don't know what Dad would want. Would he like that? You know? The other thing is organize your documents. Billy Shelley's a veteran, but how many people in the family can find your DD 214?
It's in the safe.
You know? Well, it's in the safe.
You know what?
I have an experience with that.
You know, it's
My
the
brother
combination
passed
of
away unexpectedly. Yeah, he had his important papers in the safe. Nobody could get into the safe.
Yeah. We actually had to track that down for something else, and it took a while.
Yeah.
We had to jump through a lot of hoops to
And you
get
were
that.
the owners of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
And they
if you,
said actually on that, I should go up there and actually make all the arrangements up there with it.
no, if they don't set aside graves.
They
or
said I could do
anything.
it, but-
You can, and it's just kind of a pre-approval thing.
No.
But they won't designate a grave for you until you pass away.
Okay.
And there's really no need to do that, as long as you know where the paper is, or if you do end up planning in advance, give them a copy to put in your file. The mortuary generally schedules anything
yeah.
there at the cemetery for you, so the family doesn't have to worry about it. And it can be done if those papers are lost, but if they're lost, it just means the National Cemetery, before they'll schedule anything, has to verify your eligibility, and that can take a week while they're looking
Yeah.
through things.
That's why we got it in the safe and made the copies. And
Yeah.
They're making a hill there. I'm gonna be on top of the hill.
Oh, okay. Don't put them in your safe deposit box for the same reason. Nobody
Can get
can
in.
go get in the safe deposit box.
Yeah.
So, make copies, tell people where they are. The DD 214, if you're a veteran, if you're getting older, maybe you wanna have a power of attorney for financial things, so that your spouse you're not dead, but you can't make decisions for various reasons, and your spouse still needs to take care of your business. The other document is an advanced healthcare directive for medical decisions, and you can designate someone to take care of that when you are unable to. And that authority extends after your passing to making funeral arrangements. The financial power of attorney ends when it gives somebody authority to decide what you can decide. When you can no longer do that, neither can they. Yeah.
We've just been working with an attorney doing all that.
Okay.
the POLST, Advanced Directive
Yep,
Power
yep.
of Attorney.
If
all
you get a
that.
trust, usually you got a notebook that has
Trust.
all those things.
And
in it.
that's what I was gonna say, and she puts it all in a big red notebook, and she said, just tell your kids to look for this big red notebook, and it has everything in
That's
it.
right. That's right.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
Robin, it sounds like there's two parts. There's the decision-making process, which is something you may want to do with your spouse. You know, do you want to, where do you want to do the service at, stuff like that. And then there's the preparation, which is the decisions regarding your casket, your burial site, stuff like that.
Sure.
Those can all be something that whoever we work with, whether it be Miller Jones or any other company, they'll help us with all that stuff.
Absolutely.
And then,
Absolutely.
and
If you've kind of had this conversation, so you already know the general direction you want to go,
Mhm.
and you want to put something in place so it's more
Market
formal,
prices, yeah.
Mhm.
then talk to somebody. We've got a member of our stake is doing this, a couple actually, so
Yeah.
you could, if you wanted to deal with a member of the church, you could. Okay? What have I got here? Questions? We've been doing questions.
Robin, the good thing about your business, you never run out of customers.
I've heard that. Everybody's dying to meet me. How's business? Dead, but it's picking up.
So what is the weirdest thing you've ever had?
The weirdest thing?
At a funeral or a request, or do you ever have to bury
Buried
somebody in
with
a
a pet or
car,
something.
or some weird thing?
No,
Greg liked to be
no,
buried
you
in the
hear,
first
you
seven.
hear about that sort of thing, but
Yellow.
no, I haven't buried any cars.
You can eat first.
Well, not weird. Actually, if there was anything weird, I probably wouldn't tell you.
Yeah.
But, you know, we've had services where the person was a horseman. They brought the horse to the mortuary, and it did its little dance outside the chapel, or they brought their horse to the cemetery. And I don't know if the horse cared, but the family liked the fact the horse was there next to and part of the funeral, so, you know, so that sort of thing. Yep. Oh,
Mine's more of a comment. My mom just passed away 10 days ago. We had the opportunity to go to several different mortuaries. Just know they are vastly different in pricing. So take an opportunity and ask, because I couldn't believe how different they were
yeah,
with things.
yeah, so.
It's a good idea.
That's the other thing, what I said about choosing a cemetery is same really with a
But
mortuary.
we were Riverside National, so that didn't cost us anything, but mortuary was, I
That-
couldn't believe how
Yeah, well,
much
that's,
is different, usually the exact same things.
okay, anything else?
Empty the crate and sell it to you.
You've all asked good questions, thanks for coming out on this
They're on the
night,
ballot.
I'm sure there were other things to do. I was afraid I'd be talking to Darren by myself. Then I find out he doesn't usually come, so I don't know who else.